Walking with Jesus through the Gospels, coming into Luke chapter 9 tonight. Verses 7 to 9. Parallel on this would be Matthew. He's in chapter 14, 1 to 12. And Mark, he is in 6, verses 14 to 29.
Now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he sought to see him.
Now, Luke has the least amount of detail of the three synoptic Gospels concerning this event. See, John has been killed by this time, and news of Jesus is growing wider and wider. Now, John the Baptizer, yes. Yep. So if you will recall on the map, when John was in prison, he was down here. So Herod, we're told, oftentimes would call for him. So being down in this region, as Herod had been for some time, he would have been secluded from many of the reports of the ministry of Jesus. Then we get the events where John the Baptist is beheaded by Herod. And the event there is recorded in Matthew's Gospel and Mark's. So they go into the detail of how it came to be that John was beheaded. If we come over to Mark chapter 6, we see the events that lead up to this. See, John had been bringing it to the attention of the people that they needed to repent. The kingdom of heaven was at hand. And at some occasion, it appears as though Herod had ridden past him, and he is rebuked by John, because he shouldn't have been married to Herodias, because Herodias was another man's wife. So she left Philip and became the wife of Herod. And Herod was willing just to let that go, but Herodias, she was infuriated. So as a result of that, she had Herod incited, if you will, convinced him to put him into prison. And this is where John has been now for somewhere around the past year. So you remember back in Matthew chapter 11, John sent two of his disciples to Jesus to inquire whether or not he was the Christ, or should we look for another. That's while John was in prison. Well, between that point and now, John has been beheaded. We know that Herod had somewhat of an affinity for John, somewhat of a liking, because he would call for him on several occasions. But Herodias, she didn't want to let it go. So on the occasion of Herod's birthday, her daughter danced for Herod and for all of his guests. And look what he says in chapter 6 and verse 23. She asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. Excuse me. She hasn't asked yet. He says this first. So Mark 6 and verse 23.
Okay, and he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist, she answered.
All right, so we can stop there. Thank you. Notice what he says to her, which is really what he should have been saying to the Lord, to God, although not keeping it just to half of his kingdom. He says to her, ask whatever you want, and whatever you ask, I'll give it to you, including up to half of my kingdom. This is something he should have been saying to the Lord. Whatever you ask, I'll give it to you, including my kingdom. No matter what, it's all yours. But he's not there. And that's what John has been really bringing to his attention, to his focus, that he would repent and give his life to the God of Israel. And of course, John being the messenger, the voice in the wilderness, crying, prepare the way of the Lord, he's pointing to Jesus, the Messiah, the one through whom there's access to the Father. So, as was read, she went to her mother, what am I going to ask for? And she said, ask for the head of John the Baptist. And this is how it came to be that John was beheaded at this occasion. Now, John's been dead for a bit of time, and Herod now, he has come up most likely to his palace in Caesarea Maritima. In this, I got to bring it up here, in this region right here, just up from Tel Aviv, from Joppa, and no doubt it's when he comes up into this region, now he's beginning to hear reports of what this miracle worker is doing. And he says it must be John. Like, he's come back to haunt me. And there are other reports going around that perhaps he is Elijah or one of the other prophets. Yeah. So he's a little bit on edge. But because he hears of what he's doing, he has a desire to find out, to see what Jesus is doing. So we see in Mark, one second, and I got to see which of the these passages that I wanted to look at. I think I'll leave that point alone for right at the moment. But he's hearing all of these reports, and the reports that are going around that he is one of the prophets or that he's Elijah himself, that's going to come into play, particularly for what Jesus is going to be doing coming up shortly hereafter of what is going on in this instance. When it says one of the prophets, what is coming to mind for many that are speaking about perhaps he's one of the prophets from the Old Testament? Not just that he's one of the prophets, but what is one of the passages that quite likely is coming to their mind? What was prophesied concerning this Messiah? He would be, I guess, kind of a...
One of the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
It could be anyone.
So all right, so a prophet like Moses. I want to come to that passage because we look at it specifically, but it can be broad-based as well. So Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, and we're going to read verses 15 to 22.
The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him, for this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, "Let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die." The Lord said to me, "What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded him to say, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods must be put to death. You may say to yourself, how can you know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him.
So ultimately, it's speaking about one prophet who will be like Moses, but it's speaking about the prophets that will be raised up following Moses up until the time that the prophet, will be brought into place. And then giving guidelines concerning those prophets whose sayings do not come to pass, don't give any consideration or ear to them. Because
The prophecy they prophesy for thousands of years down the road. So how does that part fit?
They must have had some that did come true beforehand, that probably isn't recorded. So, yeah.
So there would be those prophecies that would be obvious. They're prophesying, they're coming to pass. A false prophet, their prophecies don't come to pass. And so those that were short-term prophecies or near prophecies, they're being fulfilled and being obvious that, of course, this is a prophet of God. So those prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled, that aren't being indicated as, all right, this time tomorrow, you're going to experience this or that, such and so forth. If you recall, Elisha had said, by this time tomorrow, a seah of flour will end up being, I forget what the amount was, but I think that's 2 Kings chapter 4, regarding the siege that had been upon Samaria, and they were actually resorting to cannibalism because of their food supplies were going so low. And Elisha said, by this time tomorrow, you will see there's going to be an abundance of food. And the general didn't believe it. And he said, you will see it, but you will not eat any of it. That's a very specific prophecy. Is that 2 Kings 4? So it is in maybe 2. Since we've brought attention to it. Now we are on a search 7. Yeah, so it's chapter 7. I think it's part of the last part of chapter 6 as well. Yeah, so the last part of chapter 6 is speaking about the atrocities that were taking place because of the famine in the land, in the city of Samaria. And chapter 7, very first part, that tomorrow about this time a seah of flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. And I said the general, but an officer looked said, "Look, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" And then he said, "You will see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." So very specific word that is being given there. So other things that may have taken lengthier amounts of time for them to come to pass, whether they be months or years, or even centuries in some cases, where other prophecies that have been given gave it the credibility so that, all right, we need to wait until the due course of time passes. And of course, for them, where it was decades or centuries that passed, they wouldn't live to see it, but it would be recorded for their posterity that would come after them and see, yes, indeed, this word from this prophet has come to pass, just as their many close at hand prophecies had come to pass. So upon hearing this, the word comes to Jesus. And he's looking to get away on account of the fact that he had heard of it. So let's go to Matthew chapter 14. And let's look at verse 13 in this instance. Melissa, please.
Just 13.
Yes, please.
When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns.
Let's perhaps look at verse 14 as well.
When Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick.
Now, Jesus has heard this, and he is looking to get away for a bit of reprieve, just to collect himself, if you will. Remember, we look at him as being the God-man, and we focus a lot on the God aspect, but there's still the man, the human aspect of his nature, and so he's impacted by this, not caught off guard, not caught by surprise by this, but it has still impacted him just the same. And Jesus knows that he will experience the same end as John has. He by crucifixion. So it is full in his face, if you will, a reminder of his mission. That it's according to God's timetable. Remember what Jesus says to Peter after he restores him to full, if you can say it this way, full rights and privileges. Although he had them already, but he does it for Peter's sake after the resurrection on the shores of Galilee in John chapter 21. 21. And when he says to him, let's go to there for a moment, just take a glance at it. John 21. And I want to look at verses 18 to 21. 18 to 21.
I tell you the truth. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God, and he said to him, "Follow me."
22 as well.
Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper
and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him?
Jesus speaks to Peter here, speaking of what kind of death he's going to experience, and by which means he will glorify God through this death. It's this idea, this concept that our lives are in God's hands. That you and I are indestructible, immortal in a sense, until God says it's time to come home. So in that, we can trust Him in every situation. Should I die in a car accident on my way home tonight, my life is in His hands. I can do everything I can to try to avoid this and that, and this event, that disease, whatever it might take place. But our lives are in God's hands. So with that, he's seeing that John's life is in God's hands. It was his time to come to an end, because the focus is not on John. He had done the work for which he had been called. Jesus, the same. Jesus, he's not going to be ministering for the next 15 years. He only, at this point, has about another year and a half before he'll go to the cross. And so he speaks this to Peter after his resurrection, the end of John's gospel, reminding us, letting Peter know, letting his disciples at that point know, and we who are now experiencing this realize our lives are in His hand. What about John? He says, it's not any concern of yours whether I will keep him alive until I return. You follow me. In other words, keep your eyes on me, not on the other person, not on the other group, not on what they've experienced or how I'm using them to glorify my name. I will glorify my name in you in ways that are different than I will do so in other people's lives. So here we see Jesus then, back in Matthew in chapter 14. He's gone off to a deserted area by himself. Now, when he does this by himself, he has his disciples with him. By himself means withdrew from the crowds, the multitudes. I want us to go back to Luke's gospel. At the same time as he hears about this, the disciples whom he had sent out to preach the gospel, he sends out the 12 to preach that the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is at hand. And as they went, they were to go to individuals. So looking at chapter 9, look at verse 3 to 5 for a moment, just to see that this message, this gospel he's bringing to those who are willing to receive. It's not to the nation as a whole, but now to individuals who will believe and receive. Deb, back to you, verses 3 to 5.
And he said to them, take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And whenever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them.
So the individual homes, the people who believe, they'll receive them. Matthew 10 speaks of the same thing. It's a parallel there with this. That they are to go to the individual, different villages, homes who believe, in order for them to encourage and strengthen. So when they return from that ministry, that mission outreach, they return in verse 10 and they tell Jesus all that they had done. and then he takes them and went aside privately into a, what kind of a place? Verse 10. To Bethsaida. And what does it say regarding the region that they went to? Nothing in your... Can somebody read that?
Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida.
In Mark, it says a desolate place.
Okay, Luke, all right, Luke in the New King James says to a deserted place that was near Bethsaida.
Matthew says to a desolate place.
All right, so Matthew and Mark both speak of a deserted place.
It says in our footnotes to a remote area near the town.
Let me have a look here. All right. There's obviously two manuscripts that are being used for Luke's section there with the deserted place. So we're not resting just, pardon me?
Verse 12 in Luke says, for we are here in a desolate place.
In a remote place. That's here. Yeah, verse 12.
All right, so nevertheless,
There's
the context is there. All right, the focus is there. But keep in mind, a deserted or a desolate place. They are going to Bethsaida. They're leaving from the region of Capernaum to Bethsaida. Let's bring that up on the screen, please. Yeah, you're looking at it from the north, okay? So our natural orientation is to consider looking at a map this way, looking at it straight on so that north is up. But the perspective of that is looking at it from the north, looking southward, okay? So that's what you're looking at.
We're looking at north-south.
North to south, yes. So they're heading over to Bethsaida, to the east side of the Jordan River. Can you see where the Jordan comes in there? So the east side of the Jordan River. Let's have a look what yes, that's it, yep.
Not that section, not that map.
Now that's a map today, okay? In Jesus' day, the Jordan was much more robust. And much of the Jordan is dammed off now for fresh water supply for Israel and Jordan. Jordan, which is on the left side, which is the east, okay? Remember, your orientation is backwards. The left side of the screen of this map is the region just below the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, is the country of Jordan now, the nation of Jordan. So the land agreement that Israel's made with Jordan back in 67, I think it was, I may be wrong on the date, on the year. Nevertheless, it was that they would divert water to Jordan because Jordan is in the desert. So they don't have a water source for themselves. So the map you're looking at is not a map that somebody drew in Jesus' day. So this is a recent map, and therefore it shows Jordan being less robust than it normally would be otherwise. Okay, does that help out a little bit? But they're not at Bethsaida. They are in the region of Bethsaida. Okay? The reason we know that they are in the region of Bethsaida and not in Bethsaida itself is that people have come from all around, and when Jesus says to them after teaching them all day that he tells them, go buy them food, get them food, speaking specifically to Philip. And Philip says, there's not enough money. 200 days worth of salary is not enough even to buy bread for everybody, that everyone would have a bite. That it's just too far away. If we send them home, it's too far away. No, there's no place for people to get provision. So they're in a remote place in the region of Bethsaida, but not at Bethsaida itself. Okay, so they're not at that village or that town. Who's from Bethsaida? Do you remember? Peter and Andrew and? No, and Philip is also from Bethsaida. Now, let's turn our attention, pardon me? Yes, yeah, that's right. So let's go to John's Gospel. John chapter 6. Do you have something? Do you have what you need?
Yes, they are.
Now, let's have a look at verses 1 through 11. Maybe for ease, we'll split it up a bit and we'll give 1 to 5 and then 6 to 11, all right?
Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up to the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw the great crowds coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?"
He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish.
In verse 3, it says that he went up on the mountain and he sat there with his disciples. Well, that doesn't give us the whole picture of what's taking place. What is Jesus doing while he's sitting there with his disciples? Anyone know? Probably teaching. Yeah. So more than probably teaching, he is teaching. And the way that we know that is by the other accounts from the gospel writers. So Mark tells us in his account that when the multitudes had seen Jesus departing with his disciples, they ran ahead from all the cities that were around, and they arrived before them and came together. So before Jesus arrives on shore with intentions of going to a deserted area with his disciples, all of these crowds have ran on ahead, although the distance was greater by land than it was by boat. They were able to get there faster because of the speed with which they went and the ease or the leisure that the disciples and Jesus ended up sailing or rowing, whatever the winds were like that day. But we see that Jesus in verse 34, Melissa, would you mind reading that? Mark 6 and 34. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at 6 and I'm forgetting to tell you that I'm in Mark. Mark 6.
Hold on a second.
We're getting a workout and going various places tonight. Mark 6.
When Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things.
So there we have, for sure, not just probably taught, but that we know for certain that he taught. And when the day was coming to a close, well, now the disciples are saying it's a deserted place, you better send them away because they don't have anything to eat. Jesus has a focus on them. Now remember, why did Jesus go? Why did Jesus get away from the crowds? Because of what happened to John the Baptist and because of his disciples just came off of a ministry tour where they've been going pretty well flat out. And it's, let's get away, guys, to rest. Time to rest. But it's prevented because of the crowds. But instead of becoming perturbed, upset, and all about my rights, what about my comforts, Jesus had compassion on them. And he spends the day teaching them. What is he doing? He's pouring into them the Word of God. In spite of his sorrow that he'd been experiencing, in spite of exhaustion for his disciples, he sets all that aside. Why does he do that? Coming back fundamentally to the fact that Jesus, he didn't do it just because he sees the crowds. He did it because he said he had compassion, but he could have had compassion and not taught them at that point. He could have waited. Pardon me? They're like sheep without a shepherd, so that means they're wandering. They're in need of direction. Furthermore, Jesus did nothing except that which he saw his Father doing. And he didn't speak except that which he heard his Father speaking. So the Father's saying, shepherd these people. You want to rest. I know your body is weary, your emotions are taxed. But I will give you strength. Shepherd my people. Now, with the backdrop of Exodus, what comes to mind with a people that are like a sheep without a shepherd? Who comes to mind? Israelites, and taking it right back to Egypt. And Moses is given to them as a shepherd. So he will shepherd. Moses, for the last 40 years, before he goes back to Egypt, has been shepherding sheep. The Lord has been teaching and training and preparing him to shepherd people, to lead people. Because when they came out of Egypt, they were free as far as physically is concerned, but mentally and emotionally, these people are still in bondage. And so you put them out with freedom, but not give them any direction or leadership, they are just going to wander. And they're going to get lost. They're going to get in trouble and in danger. So God leads them out, gives them a shepherd to guide them and to lead them. It's not the only time we're going to see in this passage This is the first aspects of seeing the backdrop, particularly in this event that takes place. This, apart from the death, the crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, it's the only event that happens in all four Gospels. There's something of importance that is being brought to attention for us here. And it's bringing right back that this is the prophet that Moses spoke about. This is the one who is like him, but greater than him. If we were to look at the book of Hebrews, we see that Moses was a builder in God's house, but Jesus is the son in God's house. Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater, over and over again. So we're seeing that Jesus is a fulfillment of the type that Moses was, being a shepherd to the people. But we see it even in the context of the miracle that he performs on this occasion. But before he performs it, he brings something to their attention. Well, first of all, so we got the backdrop that Jesus, he's seeing them as a sheep without a shepherd, so he is their shepherd. We will see back in John chapter 6, and it is John. What time of the year is it? What season? Verse 4.
Passover festival.
So Passover is at hand. So it's very, very near the Passover. So in that context, we're bringing Passover together with bread, shepherding. Yes, you're right, shepherding. So I just, what I heard first, so it's not wrong, it's right. All right, so we got shepherding and bread. Where does Jesus go? He could have been on the plain, but instead he goes up on a mountain. So we see an aspect of that with Moses as well in Exodus chapter 19. Moses ascended the mountain of the Lord to receive the word from God and brought it to the people. Let's look at verse 5. So we're still in John chapter 6, verse 5.
When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?"
Yep, that's good. So he's doing this because he already knows what he has in mind. What's the best response in this? Without looking ahead, not what did Philip say? What's the best response to this? If Jesus said to you, if you were there, you're one of his 12, and he says to you directly, "Where will we buy bread so that these people may eat?" What's your response going to be? I have no idea. Think of this. In Ezekiel chapter 37, the Lord brings Ezekiel to a valley, and he sees in that valley is full of dry bones. And he says, the Lord says to Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And what's Ezekiel's response to the Lord? "Oh Lord, you know." I don't know. For me to try to come up with a really impressive answer is not going to impress at all, because I don't know. It doesn't look like they can, and you can do it, but I don't know if it's your will to do so. I don't know what the purpose of the lesson is here, of what you're showing me this for. Lord, you know. So he's putting it back and says, "Lord, I'm waiting on you to tell me." Okay, so Andrew's response is?
Well, there's a boys' lunch here. It almost sounds sarcastic.
Yeah.
Here we're saying 200 days worth of wages, or, well, I've got a boys' lunch.
Yeah.
He even says, "But how far will that go among so many?"
Well, like, I don't understand why he did that. Like, what was in his head? Was it faith? Did he think of the Old Testament passage where there's multiplication of bread? It was a lot more bread for a lot less people, though.
Yeah.
Or, like,
So let's go back to 2 Kings chapter 4.
Be hopeful, probably. He's a positive fella.
All right, let's look at 2 Kings chapter 4, 42 to 44. (42 to 44). Pardon me? Todd, is it? Okay.
A man came from
Yes, Shalisha.
Shalisha, bringing the man of God 20 loaves of barley bread, baked from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of the new grain. Give it to the people to eat, Elijah said. How can I set this before 100 men? The servant asked. But Elijah answered, give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and have some left over. Then he set it before them, and they ate, and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord.
Now, this is more loaves than what Andrew comes up with, but it's still too few loaves to feed the amount of people that were gathered together. So I think an aspect is Andrew's looking. So I've looked, and all I can find is this much, but we have this much. So according to your word, whatever it may be, if you can use it, then use it. If not, then we wait on you. What is the solution? How is it that we're going to follow through on this? So I think there's an element of them knowing the scriptures enough that, all right, Moses was able to feed the multitude, but it wasn't Moses, it was God. But it wasn't a multiplication of something they already had. It was a miraculous provision of something that they'd never seen or known before. But they have the scriptures and the history of it showing, fast forwarding now to Elisha, one of the prophets who is hearing and living by the word of the Lord. It says, according to the word of the Lord, they shall have some left over. So even as Moses had said, the prophet shall come after me, hear him, listen to him. So not just him, the prophet, but the prophets, those prophets that God will raise up after me until the time of the prophet, the Messiah, comes into place. Which includes, of course, Elisha, and quite possibly Andrew's recalling that. He's probably racking his brains thinking, what did God do in our history? What did he do? How has he fed people? And of course, this one is very clear. And that God can make provision where there seems to be no provision right now, even as we saw near the top of our study with a few chapters later, chapter 7, when the Midianites were destroyed, defeated, they took off, left all their plunder, and all of a sudden now there's an abundance in Samaria. So, is that the full answer? I don't know. But it satisfies some questions in my mind. Probably not all of them, but it certainly starts to bring attention back to the scriptures attention. So it's an act of faith for sure. I don't think it's him being sarcastic in the least. It's interesting that he asks Philip directly, though. Why Philip?
Did Philip keep the money for for the group? Is he the one that did that?
Good question. No, it was Judas. It was Judas. So it wasn't because he had the money. Any other thoughts? So they're from that area. Okay, that's one aspect. So why didn't he ask Andrew? All right, Andrew's already on his way. Food, we need food. Does anybody have food? We're starving here.
That little boy. Steal his lunch.
Yeah. Okay. He could have waited until Andrew got back, or he could have asked Andrew before he left if he's gone out to do this. I don't know for certain why he asked Philip, but his name can lend some of the reasoning behind it. Anybody know what his name means? Philip. Lover of horses. What does that speak to you about, scripturally speaking? All right, can you say that again and say it louder, please?
Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God.
All right, so let's go to Psalm 20. That's one passage that we're looking at. That's the last verse in Psalm 20. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's verse 7. I was thinking there was only 7 verses. There's 9 verses in chapter 20. So let's
Because verse 8 says they collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. Jude does say in one of the passages, don't send them away or they may
collapse on their way. Good attention. Can you say that louder just so that in case it was not picked up?
In verse 8, it says they collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. And in, I'm not sure, I think it's Matthew maybe, Jesus says that if you send them away, they'll collapse on their way.
We can't send them away empty-handed or empty-stomached, because if so, they're going to collapse. I don't think it's Matthew. I failed to write that one down, but you are correct. There's one other aspect that's with this. It's more than just this idea of them collapsing, that those that don't have their trust.
No, it's feeding the 4,000, he said that, not the 5,000.
I got ahead of myself. Thank you. All right. Nevertheless, the concept is still there, context. Okay. But in Deuteronomy chapter 17, Deuteronomy 17. This is the context of where we see this coming from, of Psalm 20, verses 14 to 20. But particularly, I want us to zero in on, let's look at 16. I'm going to give the context. The Lord is speaking to the nation as they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And it will come a time when they will eventually choose for themselves a king. When that time comes, He's giving directions for them, so they'll have this as a record going forward that they will look back upon. And here in part is what He says to them. So verse 16.
Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again.
So he's not to multiply for himself many horses, and specifically not to go back to Egypt to get horses. But why is he not to multiply horses?
People will trust him.
Right.
Your horses or your chariots.
Right, so some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. So they have collapsed, they have fallen, they have bowed down, but those who don't trust in the Lord, but those of us who do trust in the Lord, we're going to stand and rise up, or upright. So then the call is, "Save, Lord, may the King answer," when we call. So I wonder if there's a part of that reflected in Philip's name that Jesus is saying, "All right, Philip, what say you? What do we do? How are we going to feed these guys?" And if he's looking in his own strength, it's going to be, "I have nothing. I have nothing." As strong as I might consider myself to be, or we to be as a group of disciples, we don't have the resources required. But Jesus says this to him, why? To test him, because he already knew what he was going to do. It's not Jesus looking for a consensus. "Guys, I'm out of ideas here. Give me your best. Let's brainstorm." But he's coming to them, giving them the opportunity to reflect back on him as their provider, for him to say, "I am the answer here, guys. I'm the shepherd, and the shepherd, according to Psalm 23, is going to do what? And how so?" So just stop right there. Just by he leads me, right? And leads me beside still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures. But so in this instance, there's
Specifically says that. There's nothing in the Bible that's not there for a reason.
exactly.
There
So,
were sheep without shepherd, and there was much grass. It reminds you of something.
but how did they get there? Jesus went to that location specifically. They didn't just form a swarm and they wound up here, right? Jesus led them. All right, well, let's continue here for a moment. When the boys' lunch is brought to Jesus, he's got 5 loaves of fish and 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. What kind of loaves are they? Barley loaves. Speaks of 2 things. What does it speak of? Speaks of poverty is one thing. So barley speaks of poverty. Pardon me? Represents the Gentiles. Pardon me? In Ruth it does. So keeping Ruth in mind, what else does it represent? Why does he have loaves of barley? Why doesn't he have loaves of wheat? They grew both. Good guess. They grew both.
Near Passover, and that time of year, is barley first, and then several weeks later comes wheat harvest.
Right. So this is the time. It's the time of Passover, leading up. So coming on to this point in time, it's the barley harvest. So it's more than just that poverty or poor. So it doesn't just mean that only the poor ate barley, because Boaz was a very rich landowner, but what was he harvesting? Barley. It just was more affordable than wheat for the commoner. So if you had an option of wheat or barley, so down the road in a number of weeks, then if you are a person of means, you're likely going to buy wheat. If you're not, you're more than likely only going to buy barley because it's going to get you more for your money.
Wasn't it a barley loaf too? That Gideon went to the camp with the guy in the tent. He talked about his dream. And said, and the barley loaf
The
coming.
barley loaf came and rolled and,
Yeah.
and basically bowled over our camp and destroyed us. Yes, it is. Yeah.
I don't have any to this, but
Mm-hmm.
I just remember hearing
Yeah.
reading that part too.
Yep. So it's that which speaks of insignificance. Other people might pass it over for something better, but God used it to feed a Gentile widow and her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi and Ruth. And in the course of that barley harvest, what happened? Boaz gained a wife. The Jewish Goel, kinsman redeemer, gained a Gentile bride. The church. So Jesus tells the disciples, get everybody to sit down. Takes the loaves. When he'd given thanks, he distributes them. Pardon? Is that a private aha moment, or is that something? Okay. So he gets the disciples to take the bread. They don't know how it happens. It just happens. In their hands, after he gives thanks, he starts to distribute it to his disciples, and then they start passing it out to the crowds. And it doesn't stop. It never gets empty, to the point that everybody gets as much as they want to eat. They ate as much as they wanted. I can see we're not going to get to walking on water tonight. We're not going to be able to tie all of this together until next week, when we see the walking on water and Jesus teaching back in the synagogue in Capernaum when they go back to the other side. But we see the picture here that Jesus gives bread for the masses. So this is more than just multiplying a boy's lunch for a sizable group of people. This is doing something that is just, I mean, even if you stretched it to its limits, you might feed a handful of people with that size of a lunch. But nowhere in the thousands as are present today. But this harkens back once again to Moses. So again, the one through whom the people are being fed bread from heaven. And the people called it, in Exodus chapter 16, manna. Meaning?
What is it?
What is it? What is it? Why 2 fish? Good question. To which I don't know the answer. I want to know as well. I haven't come across that yet. So
There's 5 loaves and 2 fish. What would the 5 loaves be? The number of the 5
God's favorite number.
loaves. Yeah, you add them together at 7, so.
5 speaks of grace. 2 loaves or 2 fish? I don't know. Except that fish is a type of meat, and it brings back. Let's look at this one thing, okay? Let's go to Numbers chapter 11, and this is where we will end tonight. Pardon me? No, that's right. I can't answer if I don't have the response. Numbers 11. And I want to read, let's see how much I want to look at here as we wrap this up. The context. So the people are complaining. This is another time that they complain. They didn't complain just once. So back in Exodus chapter 16, they're only a couple of, they're only about a month out from Egypt, thereabouts, when they're saying, we have no food to eat, we have no meat to eat. And that's when God gives them manna and also gives them quail. Causes quail to come into the camp, and they ate it for a month. Yes. Then we see later on, once again, they are complaining. We don't have meat to eat because the bread continued, the manna, the bread from heaven. So I want to refer to it as bread from heaven because that's the more accurate way to refer to it. That's what Moses referred to it as. That's what the people identified it as, manna, because they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what to call it. But man speaks of that event as, what is it? God looks at it and speaks of it as bread from heaven. Okay? The Lord is going to bring them meat. Let's look at verse 13. Who are we at?
Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, give us meat to eat.
And then he tells them, I'm going to bring meat to you. And the quail are going to come in, and this instance, I think I'm mixing them up. This is the one where it's they ate quail for a month. In Exodus 16, they had quail for
Get enough meat. It's similar to what Jesus asked them. So again, this passage might come into their mind.
exactly, yeah.
Shall all the fish of the sea be gathered for them and be enough?
Mm-hmm. So with that, so that verse, I've the fish of the sea. All right, so that's just before the one I want to have a look at. All right, let's look at 22 and 23. That's still Numbers 11. And Carolyn, will you just take us through there, please?
22.
And 23.
Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? The Lord answered Moses, is the Lord's arm too short? You will now see whether or not what I say will come true for you.
All right. And it did come to pass. They had quail for a month. The Lord says you shall eat it, not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, not 10 or 20, but for a whole month until it comes out your nostrils. That's a lot of quail. In Psalm 78 and verse 19. Verses 17 to 19. And this is what we will end on. Yes.
But they continued to sin against him, rebelling in the wilderness against the Most High. They willfully put God to the test by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God. They said, can God really spread a table in the wilderness? True, he struck the rock, and the water gushed out. The streams flowed abundantly, But can he also give us bread? Can he supply meat for his people? When the Lord heard them, he was furious. His fire broke out against Jacob. His wrath rose against Israel. He did not believe in God or trust him.
And then he continues on in saying that he caused manna to rain down in verse 24. And in verse 26, he caused an east wind to blow. And 27, he rained meat on them like dust. Can God prepare a table for us in the wilderness? Where did Jesus take the people? In a deserted place. Why? To show that he is the one who is the provider. Can God prepare a table in the wilderness? So we're going to look at that more and tie some things together as we see that once this is over, this event is over, they've eaten, they've collected 12 baskets full, then Jesus is going to send his disciples across to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus will walk on the water. We'll see how that ties together and why did he walk on the water instead of doing it some other way, and the teaching that he ends up giving to the people in Capernaum and what happens before that teaching takes place.